A bit of backstory. I was working at a small chain motel in the Midwest as a night auditor, so my hours were normally 11 p.m. to 8 a.m. With those kind of hours and being a woman, I'm bound to have some weird stories. The scariest time I've had working there happened within my first month. So, it was a little before my shift started, and because I was single and 22, I was on Tinder before work. I matched with this guy who seems cool, a little goth alternative and into Ouija boards and tarot, which is my type, so I was hype at the time. We talk for a bit and I tell him I have to go to work. We say goodbye. Now, tonight was my first night off training, so I was running the motel by myself for 9 hours. I was already a little nervous, but then this vaguely familiar guy comes up to the front desk and asks for me by name. In my head, I've got red flags blaring at me, because this dude is weird, not by looks, but just by vibe. I tell him that that's my name, and he explains that he was the guy from Tinder, and he saw that I was less than a mile away, so he went to see if I was possibly working at his hotel. That's right, this guy was staying where I worked. Red flag number 2. I stayed behind the comfort of my desk for 2 hours because this guy won't stop talking to me, mostly about how his ex left him, how he beat people up, and how he wanted to bang me. Needless to say, I was uncomfortable, and this hadn't happened to me before in a work environment, so I did not know what to do. He finally decided to go to bed, 2 or 3 a.m., and I took a much-needed smoke break. I go outside, and right after I spark up, guess who shows up? Creepy dude. I snooped a bit on his account, and he was a painter and was doing work locally, so he wasn't from here. He tells me about where he's from and keeps getting closer and closer to me. He asks if he can smoke weed, which I said yes so he'd get away from me. I showed him where the cameras wouldn't be watching, and he pulled me in, smelled my neck, and started grabbing my ass. I swiftly hit him and told him he better not fucking touch me. I threw my cigarette on the ground and grabbed my phone to call my boss before going inside. Creepy dude rips the phone from my hand and proceeds to text himself. Now he had my number. The first thing he sends me is a grotesque picture of his extremely bodied, modded penis. I have seen some penises in my day, but that was like nothing I had ever seen. Then came the creepy BDSM porn gifs with captions like, "I can't wait to do this to you. You know what room I'm in." Now, I'm already freaking out, and I don't know why I didn't call the cops, and my boss wasn't answering, so there's me in the back office having the panic attack of my life when I get one more video. Why I clicked on it, I'll never know. I refuse to say what I saw in detail, but it was a snuff porn film. I then locked myself in the back room, cried, and waited a few hours before proceeding to make hotel breakfast. The text went on for a few days until I had enough, and I got the balls to tell my boss. He immediately kicked out Creepy Dude and banned him from our hotel. His company is not even allowed to book with the hotel anymore. In hindsight, I should have called the police, but I was too scared. Creepy Dude, let's never meet again. For a little bit of background, we lived with our grandparents. Our dad had died and our mom got into drugs. Our grandparents had this huge 80-acre plot of land and had a bunch of trails that had been made for deer hunting and four-wheeling. Along those trails were handmade deer stands that we were allowed to use as tree houses when it was the off-season. The town was very rural. Our driveway was a half a mile long, and the closest neighbor took about a half hour to bike to. The town only had about 1,200 people in it, so everyone knew everyone. You know how it goes. When this happened, I was about 10 and my sister was 15. We had just gone on summer vacation the week before. My sister wanted to go to her friend's house. Our grandparents let her go on the condition that I had to go with her. I was super excited. My sister was less than thrilled. As soon as we got out of our driveway, my sister picked up the speed, wanting to leave her dumb little sister behind. It worked. Pretty soon I couldn't even see her anymore. I wasn't too worried about this. It wasn't the first time she had left me behind, and I knew the way to her friend's house. I had only been riding for about 5 minutes when I heard a honk. I pulled closer to the side of the road, as there were no sidewalks, but they honked again. When I turned around, I saw that it was a rusty red truck. There was a crack in the windshield and fuzzy dice hanging from the rearview mirror. I put up the kickstand and walked to the driver's door, thinking it was one of my grandpa's friends. It wasn't though. He was younger than my grandpa, around 40 years old. He had greasy blonde hair. He was covered in dirt and engine oil. His teeth were very yellow and I could see silver caps when he smiled. I waited for him to roll down the window, figuring he needed directions. He had a huge grin on his face. He asked me what I was doing out there. I told him that I was riding my bike down to a friend's house and that my sister had left me behind. He told me he can give me a ride, which I declined. He got a little mad and said he was just trying to help. He asked me if I liked puppies. I said yes and told him about my puppy Figaro that I had gotten the year before. He told me he had a puppy and that I should look in the back of the truck where I was. I waited back. He got out of the truck and opened the back, but there was nothing there. He grabbed my arm, but I was able to pull away. I ran right into the woods. I quickly found an old trail and climbed into one of the deer stands. It had wedge cuts into the tree and had a little platform with a chair to sit on. I sat up there and cried. I thought for sure he would find me and I'd never see my family again. I could hear the man shouting at me, telling me to stop being a bitch and to go to him. If I didn't, he would make everything worse for me. Eventually, he went away, but I was afraid to go down for fear that he was just out of sight waiting for me. My sister and her friend came back down the road about a half hour later and found my mangled bike. My sister freaked out and started screaming for me. I came down then and went over to her. I told my sister all about the creepy man. He must have run over my bike when he left. My sister didn't want to get in trouble for leaving me behind, so I had to tell my grandma that it was my fault the bike got broken. I ended up being grounded for 2 weeks. I never told my grandparents, and I never saw the man again. I hope I never do. This happened to my mother in 1959/1960. I know the stories that aren't in first person are usually frowned upon, but this is too good, too frightening not to share. It is very literally the urban legend that your parents used to warn you, but it happened, as corroborated by her neighbors and family. My mother grew up in the Northeast, on a somewhat quiet street. Everyone knew each other in the neighborhood, and my mother would have free rein to play outside until her mother called her in for dinner. Think Leave It to Beaver type scene, except not everyone was so wholesome. This happened when she was about 7 or 8 years old. My mother was, and still is, naive in her own way. She assumes the best about people unless proven otherwise. She enthusiastically talks to anyone and everyone. I have to pry her away from strangers telling her their life stories at bars. She had a similar level of interest and trust in others as a child. So, this was another day in the neighborhood. Her older brother wouldn't take her out to play, so she walked down the street and called out her friend Jimmy Grant, who was a year older than her. It had recently snowed and they amused themselves climbing snow piles up and down the street. They ended up close to the house of Mrs. Kelly. My mom knew about Mrs. Kelly's reputation as the neighborhood deviant. She was in her late 60s and lived alone. My mom said she looked like a witch. She would steal the milk deliveries from her neighbors, who in turn didn't report her because they felt bad. My mom said you used to see her climb her front steps on all fours, like an animal. Her dress hiked up around her waist. So, they're zipping up and down the snow piles while Jimmy looks past my mom and stiffens up. It's Mrs. Kelly, and she's standing behind my mom with a big metal shovel slung over her shoulder. She says she needs help and that she needs them to come to the side of her house. Jimmy is scared, my mother can tell. She is apprehensive but not afraid of Mrs. Kelly. She doesn't have the innate sense of fear she should have. So, off they go to the side of Mrs. Kelly's house. Mrs. Kelly, still wielding the shovel over her shoulder, tells my mother and Jimmy that she had locked herself out of her house. It's cold and it will be dark soon. She says she needs Jimmy to be a good boy and crawl through the basement window. He can get inside the house and unlock the door for her. Jimmy is much more savvy than my mother. "I can't, Mrs. Kelly. I'm too fat. I'll get stuck." So smart. Mrs. Kelly, undeterred, says fine and tells my mother that she will have to crawl through the window then. My mother starts to get nervous, but she is scared of this woman wielding a big shovel and feels like she should always do what an adult tells her to do. So, Jimmy stands aside. Mrs. Kelly pushes open the basement window and tells my mother to crawl in. Feet first. Tentatively, my mother backs her little boots in, then her legs, and scoots back on her belly. She can't feel the ground under her feet. Mrs. Kelly tells her to keep going. My mom keeps backing up until she's dangling by her hands. She drops several feet and Mrs. Kelly closes the window. My mom has dropped down into complete darkness. She can't see where she is. She reaches around and realizes she has fallen into the coal bin. The bin is only half full and my mom realizes the walls of it are too high for her to make her way out on her own, especially in the darkness in an unfamiliar basement. Meanwhile, outside, it's getting dark and Jimmy is panicking. By now, Mrs. Kelly has retreated to the front porch. And had left Jimmy standing in the snow staring into the dark basement window. Jimmy can't hear my mother calling for help, but he knows something is wrong. He decides he's going to get help. Jimmy tells Mrs. Kelly he has to go home for dinner. She ignores him, and he takes off running down the street. He doesn't go home. He goes running to the neighbor, Mr. Burke, who is a police officer. He tells Mr. Burke the story, that Mary Jane, my mother, is in Mrs. Kelly's basement and needs help. Mr. Burke takes off up the street. He gets to the front of the house, which is now in complete darkness. Sitting in a chair on the porch is Mrs. Kelly. He asks her where Mary Jane is. Mrs. Kelly laughs and says she has no idea. He asks if she is indeed locked out, and she says yes. Mr. Burke goes and expects to have to break the front door, but he pushes it, and it sways right open. The door was never locked. Mrs. Kelly never needed help. Mr. Burke gets to the basement door. It is locked. He kicks it open to the absolute rage of Mrs. Kelly. In the dark, he finds my mother. She is still in her snowsuit, curled up in the bottom of the coal bin. She is covered head to toe in coal dust, whimpering, terrified. My mother said nothing happened to Mrs. Kelly because of what she did, but that everyone in the neighborhood, especially those with children, knew about it. They all took what happened as a warning. I'm terrified what could have happened to my mother if she had been alone that day, or if she had chosen the company of a less clever and careful boy than Jimmy. This happened about 6 months ago, and I recently took an Uber for the first time since this incident, so I thought I'd share. I was leaving a work function at a bar around midnight in a large city about an hour away from the suburban home I share with my partner. For reference, I'm a woman in my mid-20s with an average build, and I was a bit buzzed that night. I'm talking like 3 drinks, so not incapacitated in the slightest. Anyway, I'd ordinarily take a company car home, but I hadn't reserved one since I didn't know what time I'd be leaving, so I just decided to Uber. The company reimburses me for the bill anyway, so it was no difference to me. Once the Uber pulls up, I say goodbye to my colleagues and get in the back seat. I'm always very nice to my Uber drivers, so I introduce myself. This driver, let's call him Ed, seemed totally normal, no red flags, and we make a pleasant conversation for about 15 minutes until we are squarely out of the city on the way to the suburbs. From this pleasant conversation, I learn he lives in a certain neighborhood not far from my home. Note that his neighborhood, while relatively nearby, would be completely out of the way on the route we are taking to my home. The conversation reaches its natural end, so I just stay a bit quiet and start looking at my phone, Reddit, whatever. The quiet is interrupted by his voice, suggesting I take a nap if I feel tired. It didn't even strike me as weird at first, so I just thanked him for the offer, but I wasn't that tired. He then said, "Oh, I always get sleepy when I'm drunk. Are you sure?" At this point, something in my body made me even more wide awake than before. I replied that I wasn't drunk, and like I had said, I just had a few drinks, so no need to nap. I'll be home soon enough anyway. He drops it after that, but I still thought it was weird he'd say that. About 5 minutes later, he says that the highway has some weird construction going on and that the single-lane traffic ahead would make my trip way longer than it needs to be. He asks if it's okay to take another route. I oblige, already on edge and just wanting to be at home. My partner calls at that moment, asking when I'll be home, and I make sure to make it very clear I was talking to my significant other. Something was weird about this guy, and I wanted him to know that someone is expecting me at a specific time and knows where I am. After I hang up the phone, the Uber driver stays quiet and we get off the highway. On a different exit that I'm not used to, but I guess that's to be expected on a different route home. I'm bullshitting on my phone because I don't want to talk to this guy anymore, not even looking up until he says, "My house is only 5 minutes from here." Okay, pit in my stomach. I'm probably a good 25 minutes away from my house right now, a distance enlarged by a shortcut. I say some nonsense about how I like the neighborhood and how my boyfriend and I were thinking of moving here instead. Blah blah, basically anything I can think of to make it seem like I don't think this is weird and I'm not picking up any signals. Surprisingly, he doesn't say anything in response and now starts driving on a road in a direction I know led to my house. Phew, crisis averted, right? Except, not really. 15 minutes go by and my surroundings are more familiar. Just as I'm starting to feel more at ease, he starts asking questions about my boyfriend. What does he do? How long have you guys been together? And other seemingly normal questions. Finally, with about 10 minutes to go, he asks if my boyfriend makes me happy. He does, very much, so I gush a bit and say, yes, he makes me very happy. Then he asks if I make him happy. I thought that was weird, but humor is my defense mechanism, so I say, well, I should hope so. 8 minutes away, he turns onto a side street and pulls over on the side of the road, looks back at me over his headrest, and asked if I'd make him happy too. I said, what? Mostly because I can't even believe what's happening. He asked again, do you want to make me happy tonight? I take a second to think through my options. I'm alone with this guy who's behind the wheel. This street is dark and I don't see any lights on at nearby houses. And I don't know what the hell this guy has in the car. I default to the response many women know to the true barrier to men's advances. I don't think my boyfriend would like that very much. His weird grin falls away from his face and he says, he doesn't have to find out. Come on, make me happy. I know a few ways you can start. I tell him my boyfriend is expecting me home any minute, and besides, I love him. I don't want to hurt him. Can you please just take me home? I carry a small knife and a little canister of mace, but all I can think of was to appeal to this guy's sensitive side. Somehow, it worked, and he didn't say another word after that. Just turned back around and silently drove me home. Weirdly enough, I say thanks as I get out of the car. And that was that. I go into my house and I start crying immediately for some reason as soon as I hug my partner. He tells me I need to contact Uber immediately and tell them what happened so this guy doesn't try to take advantage of anyone else. I agree and pull up the app to file the complaint. Except, when I look at my last ride, the picture in the profile was 100% not the same guy who drove me home. The car was the same, but not the driver. The guy in the photo was brown and wore a turban, maybe early 40s. The guy who drove me home was white and seemed just a bit older than me. My Uber never followed up with me and just refunded my money. I tell the police what happened because my partner insisted, but they didn't take me seriously since nothing actually happened. I was worried for a while since this guy knew where I lived, but apparently, it's long forgotten since I just took an Uber today. Moral of the story? Always make sure the photo in your Uber driver profile matches the person who's driving the car. Creepy driver that didn't actually work for Uber? Let's not meet. This incident happened to me about 10 years ago, and the original happened to my mom 30 years ago. So my mom and dad got married when she was 20, and she had just had my brother. They weren't well off, and they lived in an apartment above a shop. My mom is home on marital leave. She starts getting phone calls where the person is just breathing on the other end. Then the guy starts talking. He would call right after my dad had left for work and say,
"I saw your husband leave for work. I know you're alone."
He also mentioned how easy it would be to climb up the shop's awning to get into the apartment. My mom calls the police, but this was the early 80s. They couldn't do much, but suggested they change their phone number. That works for a while, until the calls start up again. The guy had called my mom's parents and spoke to her brother, who was pretty young at the time. He told him he was a friend of my parents and lost their number. My parents moved and the stalking stopped. Fast forward to the mid-2000s, I'm 14 and my mom and I are living alone in a single house. After my parents separated, we moved to the side of town she grew up in. We didn't have a car, but we lived close to grocery stores and would walk there often. My mom and I looked very much alike and are very recognizable. One day, we are leaving the grocery store and this man stops us. He knows my mom and says, "Hi, Helen, it's me, Joe." And I can tell my mom has no clue who he is. He reminds her that he was friends with her other brother in high school. She still isn't sure, but she pretends. He asks where we live, and we give him the name of the neighborhood. I know it sounds dumb, but it's a huge area. He says, "No way, I live on," and he says a street that's really close to ours, and waits for us to oblige him with our street. We don't. My mom makes a non-committal offer of getting a coffee to catch up, but they don't exchange numbers or anything. So we walk home, about a 10-minute walk. The path we take takes us through a small footpath that shortens the time, and cars can't get through there. It would not have been easy to follow us by car. So we get to our street and walk up to our door. Suddenly, a green van pulls up in front of our house, and the driver's window rolls down. It's Joe. He smiles and waves and calls out, "I know where you live now," and drives away. We kept seeing him after that. My mom would wait for the bus down the street at around 5 a.m. for work. She started noticing a green van parked just down the road from her, idling. She asked her friend to pick her up after that. I would get home from school around 3, and I also started noticing the van by my house. Often, I was with my friends, so he never said anything to me. One day, I was alone. He drove next to me and stopped. I stepped as far away from the van as I could. "Hi, Amanda," he said. "Getting home from school? Where's your mom?" I was scared, so I said she was on her way home, even though I knew she wouldn't be home for another hour. I said bye and went into my house, making sure all the doors were locked. The next day, I had just gotten into my house when someone started banging on the door. I'm talking full out police pounding. I don't answer but peek out the window, and I see that it's Joe. He begins to call through the door. "I saw you go inside, Amanda. Open up. We could have a coffee and wait for your mom." I run to the kitchen and grab a knife and wait there in the living room, too scared to make any noise. I know now that I should have called the cops. He goes on like this for the next 20 minutes, and eventually he gives up and leaves. My mom called her brother to tell him that his old friend from high school was a nut job. He then tells her, "Oh, Joe? He was obsessed with you back in school. I always suspected that he was the one calling you back then." Needless to say, we moved after that. This happened a few months ago. I work in a cosmetic store and manage the registers. Part of my job includes answering the phones. So we get a phone call, and of course, I answer. The caller claimed to be a male to female trans, and was curious about how they can use skincare and makeup to help with their transition. I've worked with many people that are transitioning, and was glad to help them. I started talking to them about what kind of services they can receive, and recommending products and whatnot. Then, it got a little strange. They told me that the hormones they were taking caused their teeth to get really sharp, and due to this, the caller was not only transitioning to be a woman, but also as a vampire. At this point, I realized that either this person is a prank caller or they need serious mental help. I didn't want to just hang up, so I decided to grab a manager and let them see how to deal with the situation. What they said to the manager was seriously disgusting and disturbing. Apparently, the caller told the manager that they were having a hard time finding humans to feed off of, but they were thinking that the next best thing for them was to drink their teenage daughter's menstrual blood. They even specified that it would be best if they could drink straight from the source. It was at this point that my manager informed the client that due to their comments they would not be able to accept their business, and if they called back again the police would be brought into it. I have no idea if my manager reported it to the police. It was close to Halloween, so I think most people assumed it was just a really weird prank call. I've been instructed to hang up and call the police immediately if the client ever calls back, or if they try to enter the store. So, creepy caller, let's not meet. I was about 12 or 13 at the time this happened, so pretty young. My mom had asked me to run across the street to Sobeys and pick up her favorite ice cream while she popped into the shower. This is normal for us. I'd go and get it for her all the time. It was legitimately right beside my house. I just had to turn down a very short sidewalk that led to an intersection, and it was on the other side of that intersection. It took me maybe 3 minutes to walk there. Anyway, when I got to the intersection to cross, there was a gentleman on the opposite side waiting for the walk sign to come on. He was tall, darker skin, and had a stone-cold look on his face. The walk light came on and we both started crossing. When we were about to pass each other, he made eye contact with me, so I smiled at him. He didn't smile back but just stared at me the whole time he passed me. It made me super uneasy inside, and I don't know why, but I felt compelled to turn around and see if he was still staring at me. He was. The entire time he crossed the road, he stared back at me, not smiling. I quickly turned around and kept walking to the store. Didn't look back. I tried to put it out of my mind and chalked it up to him being a douche canoe. When I was finished, I had walked back to the crosswalk intersection. I noticed the same man was still there. He was sitting on a wooden platter box under a sign for the gas station that was right there. He was staring at me. I felt a chill run through me, but in my naive 13-year-old mind, maybe he was waiting for someone? I felt uncomfortable enough to not cross the section that would lead me to him. I would still need to cross to that side, but I was going to try to go around it. Anyway, when he noticed this, he immediately got up and waited for the walk sign to turn on so he could cross and get to the other side where I would be. Luckily, I am a fast walker, so I got to the other side first and decided to jaywalk instead of waiting for the next walk sign. He didn't speed up, but he ended up right behind me on the short little sidewalk that led to my house, give or take a few feet. I was extremely uncomfortable at this point and kind of scared. Here was this big, dark, sinister, unfriendly looking man who had seemingly been waiting for me, and now he was right behind me. The way that my street is set up is that when you turn onto it, there are 3 visitor parking spots on each side. I turned onto my street and ducked behind a car. I wasn't even sure why, really. I mean, I didn't know for sure he was following me. I just knew I felt uneasy. He walked by my street very slowly but never turned his gaze. When he was about to be completely out of sight, I got up and started walking down my house thinking I was in the clear and that it was just me being silly. Boy, was I wrong. He must have realized he couldn't see me anywhere else on the street, so the only logical explanation was that I had turned already, so we walked back. He saw me just as I was getting into my house and then turned down my street. At this point, I was terrified and didn't care if it was my head, and I looked silly. I ran up the steps to the front door of my house, tears racing down my face. I tried to open the door, and it was locked. My heart dropped. I didn't bring my key, and I had locked the door because I didn't want to leave it unlocked while my mom was showering. I was worried someone would hurt her while I was out. I started pounding on the door, just straight screaming for my mom. I could barely see my door anymore, as my eyes were so cloudy with tears. I turned around to check on the man, and he was coming up my driveway. I screamed the loudest, blood-curdling scream I could muster at that point. My mom opened the door. I pushed her inside and slammed the door and locked it twice. I was in hysterics and ran to the window to look for the man, who I could now see taking off down the street. I told my mom what happened, and she consoled me. She was supposed to work an overnight that night, but did not want to leave me alone after that. Nothing really came from it. My mom knew I was spooked and paid special attention to me for the next little while, and I always carry a key with me now. Looking back though, I didn't learn my lesson. I still smile at strangers, but to that creepy guy who followed me home, let's not meet again. When I was younger, I studied at an Indian boarding school for 3 years. The boarding school itself is very old, situated on a hill station, and is surrounded by a wooded area. And as you can imagine, it has a ton of stories about strange happenings. Anyway, this incident has to do with when I was living in my first dorm. The dorm itself had a common room where we would have dorm meetings. The room also had a large carpet made of jute covering the entire floor, a fireplace, and a door to the woods outside. Moving on, there were 6 girls living in the dorm, and at the time, there was some sort of viral flu going around, and with a bunch of kids living in close quarters, it's no surprise that 4 of the girls fell sick. The girls were so sick that they had to move to the on-campus infirmary and stay there overnight. The same night, my dorm parents decided it would be a better idea for me and the other girl, let's call her Elle, to sleep in the common room in our sleeping bags. This was because they didn't want us to feel lonely in our room since most of the girls were gone. We were super excited because we felt like we were camping, and also because we could chit-chat past our bedtime without really getting in trouble. So, we set up our sleeping bags right in the middle of the carpet, and we were giggling and chatting for a while until we eventually dozed off. Now, this is where things get weird, and it's something that still haunts me to this day. For some reason, I woke up in the middle of the night, and although it was still very dark outside, I could make out the shape of Elle sleeping next to me. I then stared at the ceiling while my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and was wondering what time it was, when I was suddenly aware of these footsteps coming from within the room. The footsteps were slow, measured, and deliberate, and for some reason, whatever this thing was, It was walking around the perimeter of the carpet on which we were in the middle. The carpet made a loud, scratchy sound as the thing slowly dragged its feet along the perimeter. It was like a person was dragging their feet on the ground while walking, with a pause of about 1 second between each step, not once lifting their feet off the ground. This is what it sounded like to me, if you can imagine it. I was absolutely frozen with fear, and I could even pinpoint the exact location of the thing as it moved around the carpet. I dared not move and shut my eyes immediately. The thing dragged its feet around the carpet and completed the perimeter at least 10 to 15 times, and I had absolutely no idea when or if this nightmare would end. I was honestly on the edge of tears, and it came to a point where my adrenaline was pumping so hard that I mustered up the courage to tap Elle to try and wake her. I tapped her once. She didn't flinch. Then I shoved her a little harder, and she groggily pushed my hand away while half asleep and said, "What?" in an annoyed tone before immediately falling back asleep. I gulped really hard, and I was literally paralyzed with fear after this, because I just didn't know what to do. I couldn't wake up Elle, and I didn't want to risk further movement. But to my surprise, the footsteps had stopped right after I semi-woke up Elle. I was obviously still petrified and stayed frozen and was praying that the footsteps wouldn't start again. But maybe after what seemed like 5 to 10 minutes, to my horror, they started again, and I just kept praying for sunlight and that nothing would harm me, because at this point, it was all I was capable of doing. Now, I don't remember falling asleep. I might have fainted from fear, but I do remember waking up in the morning and immediately asking Elle if she had felt or heard anything throughout the night, to which she said no. I was also low-key really annoyed at her for not waking up properly, but she didn't really seem to recall anything. I inspected the entire room that morning, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but I know what I heard and felt was real, and I also know that Elle and me were the only people in the entire dorm. I definitely don't think this was a prank or that a human did this, but I still pretty much have no explanation for what happened. All I know is that it will always be one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. This happened toward the end of 2003, when I was a teenager working a shitty fast food job in the next town over. We closed at 1 a.m., so by the time we'd packed everything away and cleaned up, it was usually past 2 a.m., and by that time, I was usually eager to get home and pass out. Ordinarily, it took 15 to 20 minutes to get to and from work. It wasn't actually that far, but all the streetlights on both major streets I could take home were timed, so that you'd hit every red light along the way. However, there was a shortcut, a little road that ran right next to the railroad tracks. The major cross streets had overpasses because of the tracks, and the smaller ones just dead-ended without actually intersecting. The end result being, there was a stretch of road that steered a couple of blocks from my house and ended a mile from my work with only one stop in the middle. Young, stupid, speeding me was able to cut that commute to 5 minutes. Now, I didn't actually like taking this road. It was in a terrible state of disrepair. The posted speed limit varied from 25 miles per hour to 50 miles per hour. The faster sections always corresponding to the worst potholes. There was a fence that ran right next to the road, to keep cars from driving into the big concrete drainage ditch that also ran along the tracks. The fence was, to me, claustrophobically close to the line in some parts, as well as full of mangled gaps where people had indeed driven through the fence and into the ditch. The surroundings were unsettling as well. I'd turn onto the road just before the rusted old orange processing plant, then drive past miles of run-down old houses with the poor luck of being built next to the railroad tracks. So, one night, it's after 2 a.m., I'm driving home along this creepy road trying to get home. Just as I'm pulling up to the only stop sign along the way, I look in my rearview mirror. There is a car behind me, with very wide, rectangular headlights, and it's going way too fast considering there's a stop sign coming up. So I look both ways. It's pitch black, definitely no other cars coming, and gun it. Immediately after, I felt silly. Did I really think this car was just going to rear-end me in the middle of nowhere? But again, those headlights came up in my rearview mirror and getting closer. I wasn't certain it was anything other than my imagination, but I was creeped out. So I kept as much distance ahead as I could, and when my turn came up, I took it as fast as I deemed safe. Glancing back, the headlights followed me through the turn. I tell myself it could still be just a coincidence. Now, at this point, I'm definitely going faster than I ordinarily would, but not recklessly so. Not yet, at least. There's one stoplight ahead, the last one before home, and it's turning yellow as I approach, and I have that universal thought, do I try to make it, or do I stop? Current me would assume I was being paranoid and just stop, rather than risk a ticket, or God forbid an accident. But 18-year-old me didn't want to chance any kind of encounter with my tailgater, and stopping in a deserted intersection in the middle of the night was a no-go. I made the yellow, but barely. It changed to red while I was in the intersection. I look back and the headlights are still 30 yards behind me. I breathe a sigh of relief. That relief was short-lived because those headlights blew right through that red light behind me. Now there is no doubt in my mind this person is aggressively following me, and I have no idea why. I didn't know what to do. In 2003, most people had cell phones. I, however, was flipping burgers for minimum wage, so I did not, so calling the police was out. Driving to the police station would have been a good idea, but I only vaguely knew where it was. So, the only plan I could come up with was this. Instead of stopping in front of my house, simultaneously letting this guy catch me and know where I live, I'd turn into the alley behind my house instead. And if they followed there too, well, I didn't really think that far ahead, so I whipped into the alley, slowed down, and kept my eyes peeled for those wide rectangular headlights to come around the corner. I realized this probably wasn't the best idea when I got stopped behind a truck in the one-lane alley. The driver of the truck was closing and locking their back gate. I was in a panic, trying to think what to do, when those headlights boxed me in. I shouted to the driver of the truck to call the cops, but no person ever came. After fiddling with the lock on his gate for what seemed like an hour, but was probably less than a minute, my neighbor got back in his truck and moved down the alley. I followed, relieved. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe they decided it wasn't worth it. The truck casually stopped at the end of the alley and stayed there. And stayed there. As I was wondering just what the hell was going on with everyone tonight, the truck honked, and in response, a car I previously hadn't seen backed up to let him out. It was the wide rectangular headlights again. They had gone to the far end of the alley to cut me off. I freaked out. The blocking car had backed up into the street to my left. The truck was going straight, so I was able to dart off and to the right. I don't know if they tried to follow me beyond that. I didn't look back until I had serpentined through that residential area, to the point that I even was lost. I then pulled up in front of a stranger's house, turned off my car, and waited. It was about a half an hour before I felt safe enough to finally go home. I never found out why they chased me. Never was sure what model the car was either. But that was the last time I took that road home.